Hi, it's so great to see you all. So glad you could tune in at this moment in time to watch this video series. We're so grateful that you are part of this right now and that you're watching this at this point in time. This question and this lesson is directly tied to 12 Questions Columbus that we did in the fall of 2022 on the campus of The Ohio State University. We're so grateful that you're tuning in now and watching at this point in time. And I'm grateful that I get to introduce to you this first speaker for this first question, Dr. Terry Edwards, who's a professor from Freed-Hardeman University, where he teaches Bible and humanities. We hope you will enjoy these next 25-30 minutes as he dives into the concept and the idea of, are the places in the Bible real? Are the towns and the places that we see, are they real, and can it be proven? We hope you enjoy.
Privilege to be part of this occasion. It is important. These are times in which questions are left unanswered, and with regard to the Bible, that would be a serious tragedy, in my opinion. I love this first one that was given to me, not only because of what life experiences I've had, but because it allows me to speak of the evidence that I have from my personal faith. I have carried my faith for over 50 years personally, and I have not changed my mind yet. But every day that you wake up, you need to ask yourself, has God made you intelligent, rational person? Or is there evidence for the faith that I have in the scriptures? Are the towns and places in the Bible real? I'll be using some images from the PowerPoint that I have here, and I'll be pointing to those. And so hope that you are able to see those. And it should be, there you go, moving to the next slide. There are a lot of people in our time, especially in the last 3 centuries, that have begun to question the authority of Scripture. There are really 4 attitudes that can be held about the Bible at this point. Here are 3 listed at the top. The 4th one is the one that I hold, and maybe you hold too. It's called plenary inspiration. That is, until I have proof that something is not true, there is error in the Bible, I will find it to be correct, and I will stake my faith and my life on it. But here are 3 major attitudes towards it. The Bible is mostly or all mythology. Mythology means there's something at the core that may be real, maybe a person or a place, but the majority of the rest of it's all made up. A second attitude towards it, the Bible's worth, it lies only in that which can be explained completely by human reason. The second one says, well, I like the Bible, a lot of great stories, but when it comes to miracles, like the Egyptians drowning in the Red Sea or others like that, then we've got a completely set, and the miracle of Jesus appearing to Paul on the road to Damascus or feeding of 5,000, then we've got a very different situation. I'm out at that point. That's the way some are. There's a third one. The Bible is not entirely the Word of God, but it contains it. This gives you flexibility. What I mean by that is you can kind of like walk through a cafeteria, whether it's here of the campus or wherever it is. You can choose to meatloaf if you like it. You can skip the green beans because you've had too much of it. You can kind of pick through, rip out the pages of the Bible, rip out the stories, rip out the affirmations, the things that it states, and pick and choose what you like. That's not really the Bible. The problem with the Bible on that issue is it requires you accept it all or nothing. It will not accept a partial way. Let me give you an example. Maybe you've seen the movies of the Lord of the Rings. Great series of that J.R. Tolkien, the 1930s, that British philologist and fantasy writer. The Lord of the Rings is completely made up. The lands are made up. The characters are made up. The conversations are made up. It's complete fiction. On the other hand, there are other works, like, for example, maybe you've heard of this one. For 28 centuries, the Iliad and the Odyssey have been a twin set of epic poems that have been a dominant have had a dominant place in the history of Western culture and in schools, in scholastic education. Lately, we've kind of abandoned it, but the reading of the Iliad and the Odyssey, in my case, in my school, we had to do it in the original language, but even if in the English translation were required, because they were kind of like the Bible of the ancient pagan Greeks, as they looked to those for their heroic values and things like that. Up until the 19th century, most people thought that the Iliad and the Odyssey were complete fiction, like Tolkien, like the Lord of the Rings. On the other hand, There was a gentleman by the name of Heinrich Schliemann, a Russian-German businessman who married a beautiful young Greek wife. And with the money and with the desire, and his mother had read him the Iliad when he was growing up, he wanted to go find out with his money, was there anything real about Mycenae and Troy and that Trojan expedition and 1,000 black ships sailing across the Aegean Sea to conquer a place called Troy, to punish them for stealing one of the wives? Homer is a great poet. Some question whether he ever existed, kind of like some question the existence of Shakespeare, too. Homer was a great, talented bard, a teller of stories, who inherited tales about the heroic fights and virtues and faults of the Greek warriors like Achilles and Agamemnon and their counterparts, the Trojans, like Hector and Priam, the king of Troy. And he told it, put them together, in particular with the Iliad, with 16,000 lines of dactylic hexameter, and they're amazing. But are they made up completely? And the answer is no. That is, the Iliad has moved since the 1870s from the category of completely made up, as it was thought to be before that, to the category of there's a core, there's something real, then the gods, the conversation with the gods, one of the gods pulling back the hair of Achilles, or whatever it is, those are made up. There are parts that are absolutely real. Here's the point. It's a logical question to ask. Are those stories, those places, the geography, the rivers, are they real? The ones that are mentioned in the Bible. The Bible is full, the Old Testament, but also in the New, of places and towns and trips and travels. And the question is, can we count on them? What you see here is artifacts that Mr. Schliemann found in his excavations in the 1870s. Here's the Lion Gate of the citadel of Mycenae that was the fortress of Agamemnon, who led the expedition to Troy. Here is the geography, and they assembled right here and went to Troy, and that's where, as we call it, Troas in the New Testament, called Troy in ancient times, that's where you will see the battle took place. There are excavations that he made, and he found the ramp. There were about 9 different levels that he found of Troy. He thinks he found the one out of which every morning for 10 years, at least we are told, the Trojan poured out to attack the Greeks who were in camps along the beach, who were wanting there to exterminate them. These are the swords of the Mycenaean warriors. Oh yes, they were real. So there's a core that's real, and then there's a lot of made up in those beautiful 16,000 lines of musical poetry that are told by the great poet Homer in recounting this great story. The question is the Bible a little bit real and the rest of it is fluff? How much of it is total mythology? And here is what I am at, where I hope you will be when you investigate this fully past the time that I have tonight. 2 Timothy 3 in verse 16 and 17 says something that maybe you've heard at some point. All Scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be competent, equipped for every good work. This was written by a man called Paul, had a PhD in rabbinic literature, and he was from a city called Tarsus, but he went to college in Jerusalem, and he was the most educated of all the apostles of Jesus Christ. And he says, as he writes his last letter before he's decapitated in Rome, he says, all of Scripture, that includes the Old Testament that he grew up with, and the letters now of those that have walked and talked with Jesus, what you and I have now as the New Testament, the apostolic letters, or those that walked with the apostles as well. Here's the thing. The Bible, the New Testament, claims to be inspired. So that means it has to pass a very high bar. It can't be it can't be fiction. It can't be part fiction. It can be no fiction at all. If it says it's inspired by God, if the divine is involved in this, then it's protected from error. That's the highest bar there is. And it needs to pass that test effectively. And that means you need to bring your study and your research and your questions to the biblical text and get some answers as much as possible. One last point before I leave this. Claiming to be inspired by God doesn't necessarily make it so. For example, 1.6 billion people in the world are Muslim, and they read their holy scriptures of the Quran. And those were collections of the teachings of Muhammad when he died suddenly in 632. And here's the point. He says Jesus was a prophet, but he wasn't Son of God, and he didn't resurrect. Now, the New Testament can't be correct, and the Quran. One of the two is wrong. One of the two is incorrect on a very important feature, maybe the most important fact in all of human history. The Bible claims to be inspired like the Quran does. Okay, one of the two is not. But here still remains, as we're looking at the Bible, is there evidence for that? And here's where I introduce you to one thing that makes it different from any other collection of holy scriptures of whatever man-made religion you may have been familiar with, read about, or whatever. The Bible's different. Here are some things that no other book of mankind can live up to. How on earth do you have the unity, the coherence, the same goal, when all these factors are what compose the biblical writings? 66 books are contained in the Old and New Testament, written by 40 plus different authors. That over a span of not a few decades, they weren't all in the same room, they weren't all in the same college, in the same theology school. They were over a period of 1,500 years, and it was from the 14th century before Christ, the time approximately of Moses, all the way to the death of John the Revelator, the last book of the New Testament. They were in 3 different continents. They were in Asia, they were in Africa, and they were in what we call Europe now. They're written mostly in Hebrew, but there's some Aramaic. And then, of course, the New Testament is in Greek. And they were not all scholars writing in their offices in the ivory tower in some university somewhere. There was only one of the apostles that had a terminal degree, so to speak. Some of them were highly trained in the Old Testament, but they were priests, physicians, farmers, fishermen, shepherds, scholars, conquerors, captives, under different circumstances. Even tax collectors wrote as well. How did they all get the same story right? How did they all converge? How did they all meet at the same place? And how did they do that while the Bible tackles all the greatest questions of the human condition, of the human life? About 3 centuries ago, in our Western civilization, we began to question Scripture a whole lot. It was the Enlightenment period when we were detaching from state religions, you could say, and the impressive presence of religion in science and in literature and in politics and many other areas. There were some reasons for that, but that said, that made some also start, without study and research, start to question the authority of Scripture as a whole, not just its interpretation by certain men over time. In particular, in the last 2 centuries, we've had a lot of questioning, and sometimes from inside, that is, from theologians. We've had a lot of questioning of things, and here is the area that I'd like to go with the time I have left. Archaeology is the study of old rocks, archaeologos. It wasn't a discipline, and there were no museums before 2 centuries, and they didn't have old rocks to tell stories, not only of scientific ages, but especially of the stories of mankind. Only in the last 2 centuries have we started spending a lot of money and research and archaeologists, which I am not, by the way, but I have a good friend that is. Here's the point. Biblical archaeology came along just right at the right time to put a patch in a hole that was forming in the questioning of biblical authority. That is, what we have is in a time when there were people saying those cities are not real, those people are not real, those events are not real, those terms for those politicians of that city were not real. There were theologians starting to question, and they did it without evidence. And biblical archaeology came along to give all kinds of proof of, no, if today, while you study and still look at the biblical text, you're still on the side of, well, I lean towards my biases for the authority and authenticity of the Bible rather than I disprove of any story. If you can't prove it to me, then I'm out. Well, here's the 2 things. Persistent doubts have really hurt the faith, or the burgeoning faith and new faith of many. And biblical archaeology is an area that I would recommend that you go to. Let me start real quick with the time that I've got left. Jericho, probably the oldest city in the world, at least that's what some believe. I don't know when the earth was formed, Genesis chapter 1. I don't know the century or the millennium for that much. All I know is that I don't buy into the numbers of Jurassic Park. I'm a lot earlier than that. That said, Jericho goes back at least 7,000 years before Christ, maybe 10,000 years ago. Damascus is actually the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. But the story of Jericho, maybe you know it from Joshua 6. If you don't, read it tonight. Joshua 6 posit a people coming across the Jordan River, and they're not warriors. They just spent 40 years in the desert. And Jericho is a double-walled city, as this reproduction has here in your Bible. And they bring down a double-walled city by way of what? Going around once a day. Then on the seventh day, going around 7 times and blowing their horns. Right. Has that worked for anybody lately? It worked one time. That's all it has to work. Here's the point. This archaeologist here, even though there are still secular archaeologists that question, there were many archaeologists in the 1930s, 1950s, 1960s, Albright, Gerstang, Kathleen Kenyon, and many others. And they have disagreed. But here's a point. This gentleman right here is showing you where there was a revetment wall, a powerful cyclopean rocks that supported a mud brick wall. And that mud brick wall is not pushed in from the outside in, but it's pushed it from the inside out. What does that say? It belongs to around the year 1400 AD. That's where I'm at still right now as regard to the Exodus and 2 million Jews coming across, protected by God in their first encounter with a major fortified city. You see, you got to be careful if you're going to question the Bible, because there's egg on the face of a lot of archaeologists and theologians in the century before. For example, in the Joshua chapter 3 and verse 10 of the Old Testament, there's a mention of Hittites, Girgashites, and a bunch of other ites, because when you put an ending to Hebrew names and ancient names, you got to put ites on the end, something like that. But they were non-existent in archaeology. Nobody knew anything about them. You can't make up a people. That proves you've got error. I mean, not a person or a place, a whole nation. And of course, until a German archaeological team found their capital, and there they are. It's in a place called Hattusha. And by the way, this is one of their gates, which is dedicated to the Sphinx, which tells you they had contact with the Egyptians and the Greeks, who both used this mythological animal as part of their scary gods, so to speak. Here are their 12 minor gods right here in a row. And there is a ceremonial pouring for a libation to the gods through this beautiful we have treaties with the Egyptians. Now we have so much material. Guess what? Nobody questions the Hittites anymore. And that is how far they got. Most of what we call Turkey today, the capital was up there in north central Turkey. We now have that as well. But let's move to the New Testament. Capernaum, or Capharnaum as it's called today. It's mostly composed of Palestinians today, the city of Jesus. I love to go to Nazareth, but back in his time, when he was raised from the age of 2 to the age of 30 there in the construction business. It was only a place of about 400 people, the best we can estimate. So the only archaeological remains there. We can't find the house of Jesus. That's not going to be found. But by the way, it's not mud huts. It's rock houses that are found from the first century. But we can go to the town that he moved to. When he came out from his earthly life to begin his ministry for 3 years, to preach and teach, to do those miracles, and to save the world by going to the cross. There it is, the top end of the Sea of Galilee, a freshwater lake that is 8.5 miles long, 6.5 miles wide. And yes, it's real. And there are the houses right there in black basalt, the foundations of the houses of fishermen. It was a big fishing industry. From 400, Jesus moved to about 1,500 to 2,000. And it's a real place. And there it is along the coast of north. And this is said to be a house that maybe was the house of Peter. Jesus will say, I don't even own a coat. I don't own a house. He didn't have anything. He didn't have property. So where did he stay when he was in Capernaum? Did he stay in the house of Peter? Christians of the 4th and 5th century thought that they found some item in there that was the house of Peter. So they thought maybe that was the bedroom of Jesus. We don't know that. You got to watch out between what you would like to find and what you actually know. What I know is that black basalt foundation right there is the foundation of the synagogue that Jesus did a miracle in. And there was a synagogue ruler who had us. That is real. The places are real. And that, by the way, is the rebuilt synagogue. The 4th century, the Jews tested the metal and the authority of the Romans with a rebellion in 132. And the Romans destroyed every single synagogue in all of Palestine. And so they had to be rebuilt afterwards. But there it is, the foundation that Jesus and Peter and the rest of them were in. Jerusalem. I am showing you a model because Jerusalem is both an amazing place. Was just there this past March, and it is the convergence of all three monotheistic religions. But let me remind you again, those who are still practicing Orthodox Judaism, they can't be right if they're still expecting the Messiah, if the Messiah came. Christianity says the Messiah came. He was a Orthodox Jew from Nazareth, and then he came to Jerusalem. And Muslims think, besides the birthplace and death place of Muhammad, Mecca and Medina, Jerusalem is the third holiest place in the world. It is a conglomeration of three monotheistic religions. You can hear the calls to prayer of the Muslims, the hymns of Christians, and you can hear also on the Shabbat the prayers at the Western Wall of the Jews. You're not going to find anything related to the first century because wars and devastations, the Romans destroyed it completely in 70 AD. Then it had crusaders, and then it had Muslim crusaders, 8 different crusades, and so history has made it impossible. But what we have is a mosaic with which we build a giant size model of Jerusalem at the time of Christ. That's a mosaic that was found in the Second Temple times, the time of Jesus and the apostles. So you can see the Temple Mount and had a clear, huge presence. You can see the walls, a set of walls. The Romans only took 3 months with their siege towers to take that at a casualty cost of 12,000. You see, if God's not going to help you out against Roman legions, then you're going to lose. And they did. And God wasn't there that day for many reasons. He didn't show up. There's the Temple Mount, 13 acres. It had been destroyed, the ones built by Solomon. So the one you're looking at it in model was rebuilt over 4 centuries from the time of Ezra and Nehemiah and all the way to the time of Jesus. When they're walking out one time during the last week of Jesus' life, the apostles say, "Isn't it beautiful?" And they're proud. They look at all the fine bronze, gilded bronze and gold and marble and architecture. It's taken 4 centuries to get back to the splendor of the times of the Solomon's temple that had lasted 400 years before Nebuchadnezzar brought it down. But there it is right there, 13 acres with the Holy of Holies, 90 feet high up in the air. That's where Jesus was. I know that's a model, but you see it's created from a mosaic. First century Jerusalem, which you see the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John play out as Jesus goes to Jerusalem 3 times with the entourage, and the last time he went intentionally to be caught and to be killed, die on the cross, and resurrect. Philippi, maybe the story of Lydia. Maybe it's the first city in Europe, as we call it now. It wasn't called that back then. It was during the second missionary journey, the one traveling here in the book of Acts, a story that's written down by a medical doctor named Luke, written in beautiful Greek, by the way. He was probably a good doctor, but he's definitely a good narrator. And the point is, he doesn't make up stuff. You can check out terms that he uses for politicians in the cities. You can check out the distances and times that he gives for travel. Very specific details. Here he is. Paul wants to go, I think, to Ephesus, but he's brought to Troas. Acts chapter 16 says that he, let me use a modern illustration, was sitting at Starbucks wondering, where am I going to go now? He had a vision that said, come to Macedonia. Macedonia was that area of northern Greece where Alexander the Great had been king back about 3 centuries before. And I don't think Paul wanted to go there. I think he had to have a vision to tell him, get on a boat. He was in 3 shipwrecks. If you've been in 3 train wrecks, would you take the train? I don't think he wanted to, but the call was to go there because there were major cities up there, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea. What can I show you of Paul in New Testament times? I can show you this right here. That's the street, even though it's not mentioned in Acts chapter 16, the major highway that the Romans had built back 150 years before, the Ignatian Way, under the command of a Roman general named Ignatius. The Roman legionnaires were the fighting forces of Rome, who then constructed roads and colosseums and entertainment centers. That's what they did. And there were 30 legions, by the way, and they were the most amazing military effort ever seen in antiquity. They built a road that went from the Black Sea all the way to the Adriatic Sea, and it goes right through the downtown middle of Philippi, and then Thessalonica, and then Berea. Paul, in his missionary methodology, stays with big towns because he doesn't know how long he has, and he's in a hurry to evangelize as many towns as he can and let it spread out from there. And so while I don't have the Ignatian Way right here, you see the chariot tracks on it, first century road that he walked on, him and his three companions as well. One more thing. Lydia, he found in Philippi, there was no synagogue. That's very rare. The Jews were everywhere in the Roman Empire, more outside of Palestine than in. And they had synagogues because those were schools and the place where on Sabbath they did worship. And he was surprised to not find any synagogues in Philippi. There was a historical reason for that. The Jews and Greeks had all been kicked out by the first Roman Emperor Octavian Augustus Caesar. And so all those homes had been given over to veteran military combatants, legionnaires of Rome. It was a Roman colony, basically, is what it was. So no synagogues. You have to have 10 Jewish men over the age of 13 to have a synagogue. That was the rule back then anyway. What is this? You wouldn't even fish in it, but it's called the Crenides. It's called the Little River because Paul had to look for anybody interested in spiritual things here, or is it all about the marketplace? This is the forum of downtown Philippi. Okay, they were buying and selling and talking politics and sports. You know what we do. Okay, and they weren't discussing life and eternity and things that are spiritual. So he went out by a little waterway, a river, to find somebody that was looking for a quiet place of prayer. Her name is Lydia. She was a businesswoman from Thyatira, and she and her household were baptized. That's real, absolutely. Athens, Acts chapter 17. The Apostle Paul goes to Athens, a city that's the intellectual center of the ancient world. Rome is the political center, 2 million people. Athens only has about 50,000 at that time, so it's Podansville, but it's got the reputation of being the intelligentsia of the world. All the philosophy schools of Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates had come from there. And in those times, it was Epicurean Stoic philosophers that were the dominant two universities, you could say, in downtown Athens. Here is today the excavations. Can I point you to anything that belongs specifically to the time of the New Testament? Well, here is that temple dedicated to Athena, the Parthenon. That's why it's called Athens. They chose her as their favorite one centuries before. And it had 69 columns. And it was built over 11 years by the two greatest construction designers, Callicrates and Nyctinus. And it was a marvel. All 69 of those columns lean a little bit in, and they meet 1.5 miles up in the air. An engineering feat like no other, still being studied today for its amazing thing. It's not as big as the pyramids of Egypt, but definitely from an engineering point of view, still a marvel of ancient times. This is what Paul has to compete with. It's a fantastic building. Too bad the lights are on, but nobody's home. That's the house of the goddess, but she's fictional. She's made up. And there's people snaking up to that place right up there, taking offerings to a goddess that doesn't exist. And he stands up on Mars Hill right here by himself and heads off 50 or 100 PhDs of the time, the Stoic Epicurean, who's saying, what is this babbler? The Greek word is kind of strong. This guy that speaks gobbledygook, talks about an Eastern God they never heard. Yeshua. Who's Yeshua? Jesus, okay? He has to compete with the temple to Poseidon, temple to Athena. And he alone says, God has given you time up to now, and you pursued the divine in many ways. I'm here to tell you about the only God, the unknown God, not the one that you built massive houses to, massive temples to. There you go. Corinth. Corinth, he spent 1.5 years, the Apostle Paul did, Acts chapter 18. And here we've got some actual confirmation of the presence of the Christian story. Look, Corinth is right here. It was the 3rd largest city in the empire at the time. Rome was number 1 with 2 million, Alexandria of Egypt with 1 million, and then there was Corinth, 700,000 people. It had been totally destroyed by the Romans to prove to the Greeks, don't mess with us, then totally rebuilt by Julius Caesar with his own money. City rebuilt by Julius Caesar. Then he was assassinated. It was beautiful. It was new. And this was still remnant when Paul came in there with his companions. Um, he came in by himself, then he was joined by others later, Timothy and Silas. And the Temple of Apollo had been there for 6 centuries. Imagine if you walk into a city of 700,000 and there's a temple standing there on the hill to the god Apollo, god of prophecy, god of healing, god of music, god of visual arts, poetry. And he has that same message to tell. Beautiful building. Too bad that's not where the only true God lives. What we have records of that will confirm your faith in the narrative of Acts chapter 18 is one, there are 7 to 8 pieces of fragments of a copy of a letter of the emperor at that time to the governor of this third largest city in the empire. His name is Gallio. If you read Acts chapter 18, you'll find his name there, Gallio. We know about him. He's real. He's not made up. And there is archaeological proof of his presence. Here's another one right here. When Luke writes the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, he talks about a most excellent noble Roman. And there it is in the Greek letters, capital, the name that he uses. Even a name is not made up. If it hasn't been found, it will, or something like that. And don't give up your faith in the text unless you have proof to the contrary, is the point. It stood the test of time. Here's an amazing one. Acts chapter 16, Romans chapter 16 and verse 1 has Erastus mentioned as a city treasurer. And that in Latin says it used to be on a floor that was paid for by this very important elected position within third largest city of the empire. He was the city treasurer. He was the construction manager of a large city. And that means he had a great salary and he was approved by the people of Corinth, and he is converted, and he's mentioned in Acts chapter 16 and Romans chapter 16, verse 1. Erastus, proeditate sue pecunie stravit. Erastus made this sidewalk, paid for this sidewalk with his own money. He was thanking the people of Corinth for electing him to this great position. I could go on. Ephesus, Paul spent 3 years there. You have Paul should have died in 56 right here in the theater. Theater's real. Read about it in Acts chapter 19. That's where he should have died, except that the Asiarchs, the politicians of a major city of the ancient world, 250,000 strong, and brethren, kept him by both arms and said, don't go in. There are a bunch of people jumping up and down. They're not thinking, they're a mob, and they're going to kill you. Please distinguish. For as much as we found, we can jump at things. For example, in Rome, there are the cell of Paul and Peter called the Mamertine prisons. Unfortunately, that's not archaeological finding, that's tradition. And there's a difference between tradition and what we can know to be true. It's correct for you to use your rationality and your questions. Bring it to the biblical text. But please remember, tradition is a different thing. People have meant well in the past and made up some things. The Colosseum is not where Christians were killed. We don't have any evidence of that. However, there were many whose blood was in the Circus Maximus, one of the other entertainment centers of Rome. This is the Ostian Way. Tradition says that's where Paul was beheaded on the 3rd mile marker. And about 19 years ago, we thought we had the most incredible artifact found, a bone box with the bones of the stepbrother of Jesus, James. Unfortunately, because even people don't believe much in biblical text or in Jesus, they still can make a lot of money off of him. And the Christianity is still a great moneymaker. So somebody probably made an inscription in Hebrew on a real bone box from 2,000 years ago. It said, Yeshua bar Yosef, or James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. That was a fiction. That now is disproven. So we have to watch out to distinguish between tradition and real. Do we have enough real evidence for you to still put your faith in the Bible? Absolutely. Thank you for your question. Thank you for listening.